and then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. Simply resting in that inner purity of mind. Which is in the nature of loving kindness and compassion. What I'd like to do now is have a look at these, what's called preconditions. That is, how to set up our life in a way, to such a way to support this practice of shamatha. And this presentation is normally found in the meditation text in the context of setting up conducive conditions for doing a longer term shamatha retreat. But I think we can equally well apply this in terms of just any sort of meaningful life. And to introduce this topic, Alan Wallace talks about in Attention Revolution on page 50, and he says the following: when I lead shamatha seminars, I like to think of them as expeditions rather than retreats. The word retreat has the connotation not only of withdrawal, but also of defeat. And that certainly isn't the spirit of such practice. The word expedition, on the other hand, suggests adventure, conquest, and exploration. The Latin roots of the word have to do with extricating yourself, literally stepping out of some situation in which you've gotten stuck. In the practice of shamatha, we discover how deeply our minds are trapped in the twin ruts of excitation and laxity. In the Buddhist tradition, a mind trapped in these ruts is said to be dysfunctional, and in order to make it serviceable, it is helpful to step out of our normal activities, seek out a spacious sense of solitude, and explore the frontiers of the mind. This expedition doesn't require blind faith or allegiance to any religious creed or metaphysical belief system. Over the past 3 millennia, contemplatives from various Asian cultures with diverse belief systems have followed the path of shamatha to its culmination, and they have reported their findings. We don't need to accept their claims simply on their own authority, but if we are inspired by the earlier accounts of the benefits of this practice, we may venture forth on this path to see for ourselves whether we can achieve the results of the contemplative explorers who have preceded us. There are great adventures ahead, but also perils and dead ends. Sometimes the path is clear, but now and then it may seem to disappear altogether. The purpose of relying on those who know this path from their own experience is to save time. 6 prerequisites for sustained, rigorous training are set forth in many Indian and Tibetan Buddhist meditation manuals. These are some of the essential causes and conditions that will produce the fruit of shamatha. So let's have a look at these 6 preconditions or prerequisites. The first of the six is what's called the outer condition in terms of supportive environment. So often here there are 5 things that are mentioned. That we have to have easy access to the basic necessities. So again, this is in the context of doing retreat, so we have to have easy access to like food and water and so forth. The second one needs to be a safe place. And sometimes in the commentary on this in the old text from India, it says not to meditate in a place where there are lions and tigers. So maybe that will have a few problems then. Because a lot of, in those old days, they used to often meditate in the forest, but maybe sometimes a bit dangerous. And also to be healthy place, meaning not a place full of disease and so forth. The next one is particularly important. A place of good friends, meaning having some like-minded people around to support you. And in general, and this is something I'll talk more about in the morning of the last day, this brings up this idea of sangha, of spiritual community. And I can't really overemphasize this enough, is that if we, particularly as a beginner, want to really progress or go forward, I think we need to find this sangha. Because if we try and do it on our own, I think you're going to find it very difficult, if not impossible. Because we have very strong habits and easily influenced by others. And I know from personal experience, after I did a few courses in Buddhism, I was very enthusiastic. I wanted to go home and meditate every day and change my life. And basically for 2 years, nothing happened. Nothing happened. Because what happened was, where I went back to, there was no one else interested in doing any of this. There was no Buddhist centres, nothing. So basically I just got swept up in my old habits. And it was only after 2 years that I managed to get myself out of that into an environment where there was some sangha that I managed to start to do something. In my case, I went off to do some studies in a Buddhist centre, but I think we really need to look for this sangha, because otherwise you're going to find it very difficult to try and do it on your own. Because it seems like everyone else is going in the opposite direction and it's very difficult. We need help, support, and we need to support others. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the last morning. And the last point is well situated. So of course, if you're doing a retreat in a retreat hut, we want to make sure that that's in a very nice, quiet place and not a lot of people around. So this is the outer conditions, the supportive environment. On that point, Alamolis says the following: it is important to practice in a safe, quiet and agreeable location, optimally with a few other like-minded people. This should be a place where food, clothing and other necessities are easily obtained. Finding such an environment sounds simple in principle, but in practice it can be very difficult, especially if you try to devote yourself to practice for months on end. And that's true. If we want to find a retreat place to do personal retreat, and we want to do many months, very difficult to find anything on this planet. But in fact, this is one of probably the main driving ambition for Alan Wallace at the moment. He's setting up one of these places in Tuscany in Italy. But they're very hard to find. Very hard to find. The other 5 are inner conditions. The next two go together. And that is to have few desires and to be content. And these are with respect to material possessions and wealth. Because as long as we are putting a lot of effort in accumulating stuff, then of course we're not going to really have any time to meditate. And this really comes down to our worldview. If our worldview, and few desires is with respect to the things that we don't have, and being content is with respect to things we do have. And if our worldview is that the source of happiness and suffering is coming from out there, I think we're going to have a lot of desires because we're going to see I need more of that stuff out there because that seems to be making me happy. So we're going to put all of our effort in trying to accumulate and get more and more wealth, more and more stuff, more and more possessions, more and more pleasure and so forth. So if we really want to have these two, I think it's important we shift our worldview. If we can shift our worldview to understand the source of suffering and happiness is coming from within, then I think you'll find that you won't be putting all your time and energy trying to accumulate more and more wealth, because you'll understand that as long as you've got the basics of life, enough food, clothing, shelter, so forth, getting more is not going to help at all. In fact, it's just going to create more suffering. So we'll be able to implement those two. So on that point here again, Alan Wallace says the following. The first of these two prerequisites refers to having few desires for things you don't have, and the second refers to being content with what you do have. Without these two qualities, your mind will never settle down in practice. You will be constantly thinking of things you want but don't have, and you will fret that your present circumstances are inadequate in one way or another. This does not mean that you must quell your desire for happiness, but it is necessary to refocus your aspirations on transforming your own mind as a means to genuine well-being. And for this to happen, you must see the limitations of a life driven by such mundane pursuits as wealth, luxury, entertainment, and reputation. All these circumstances can give you is a temporary spurt of pleasure that tapers off as soon as the pleasurable stimulus stops. Mental balance is the gateway to finding genuine happiness, and shamatha is the key that opens that gate. The fourth one is also a little bit related to this, and that is to have few activities. Or in other words, to simplify our life. And as I mentioned, I think already, I often hear people say, I'd really like to meditate, but I don't have time to meditate. And again, I think that's never a valid excuse. And it is true, though, that probably most of us have very busy lives. That's the reality in the modern world. And as I mentioned the other day, some of the activities we do every day are essential. Most of us probably need to work at some level. Some of us got family responsibilities, maybe some other responsibilities. But above and beyond these essential responsibilities, we tend to fill up our day with lots of activities, and often these activities don't really bring us anything, and even sometimes they bring us suffering. What we can do to simplify our life, of course, is to simply forcibly cut these things out of our life, but I think you're going to find it's always going to be a struggle. So what Buddhism recommends here is often the two first practices, what are called preliminary practices. And that is to reflect on precious human life and death. Because if we reflect on precious human life and see that we've got not only a human life, but we've got a life full of opportunities, and then in addition reflect on death in terms of we've got all these opportunities but we don't know how long we're going to live, so then that'll inspire us to make our life as meaningful as possible right now. Because if we don't do these reflections, we're probably going to fill up our day with lots of extra stuff that don't bring us anything, and then later in our life we're going to look back and we're going to be full of regrets at having really wasted our life. So on this point, I'd like to read 2 paragraphs from a talk that Steve Jobs gave to students at Stanford University some years ago. And I think you all know who Steve Jobs was. And he said the following: "When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, 'If you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right.' It made an impression on me. And since then, for the past 33 years, I have looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations or pride or fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you're going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart." So I think some good advice from Steve Jobs. So I think if we really, and of course, you know, these sorts of practices like precious human life and death, then often when people see them, they go, yeah, I know I've got a precious human life. I know I've got a lot of opportunities, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know I'm not, I could die any day. I know that. Tick, done. Of course, intellectually, we know these things. I mean, but that's not the point. Because our behaviour is not driven by our intellectual understanding. Our behaviour is driven by our instinctive habits, experiential. So if we really want these to be helpful, we need to internalise. We need to really experientially see we've got a life full of opportunity and experientially see that it's not going to last forever. And we see that sometimes in people who've had so-called near-death experiences. People who've directly seen death and come back. Often their lives are completely transformed because of that. Because of seeing death directly, they really appreciate the preciousness of life. And so often they're full of enthusiasm and want to make their life as meaningful as possible. And that reminds me of a story. Some years ago, when I was teaching in Dharamsala and talking about this topic of reflecting on death, there was a lady in the class. She was an Irish nurse who worked in the hospice movement, you know, caring for terminally ill people. And she told me that it wasn't uncommon for the people that she was caring for, that particularly if they got over the first stage of denial, if they got to the point of accepting that they've only got so much time left, she said it wasn't uncommon for some of those people to tell her that getting the terminal illness was the best thing that ever happened to them in their entire life. because now they appreciate what life is, how precious it is, and they really want to take advantage of what time they have left. Of course, we don't need to have a near-death experience or terminal illness to have this aspiration. We just need to do these practices. Precious human life and death, and I think we'll suddenly find we'll just completely lose interest in any activities that are not meaningful, don't bring us anything. And then we're going to have time and space and energy to really devote ourselves to meditation and more meaningful things in our life. Because we really don't want to be one of these people later in our life looking back and we're full of regrets at having wasted our life. Okay, so on that point, here, Alan Wallace says the following. While you are devoting yourself to shamatha training, it is important to keep other activities to a minimum, for if your behaviour between meditation sessions erodes the coherence of attention that you have gained during sessions, you won't be able to gain any ground. Given the fast pace of modern life and the general emphasis on keeping busy, it can be difficult to make this shift to simplicity. Our work can be a kind of narcotic, concealing the unrest and turbulence of our minds. And a lifestyle that alternates between hard work and hard play can keep us constantly busy without ever gaining a clue about the meaning of life or the potentials of human consciousness. The fifth point is ethical discipline, or in other words, ethical lifestyle. I think ethical lifestyle, of ethics is of course the foundation of all Buddhist traditions, but I think it's also the foundation of any sort of meaningful life. And actually here, generally when we talk ethics in a Buddhist context, we're really talking about avoiding harmful behaviour. But here, in the Tension Revolution, he sort of expands on that a little bit. He says the following. A necessary foundation for balancing the mind is ethical discipline, which is far more than merely following social rules or religious commandments from an external source of authority. To live harmoniously with others, we need to practice social ethics, and to live harmoniously with our natural environment, we need to practice environmental ethics. The practice of ethics involves avoiding harm to others by means of our physical, verbal or mental behaviour, and leads to social and environmental flourishing in which whole communities may live in harmony with each other and with their natural environment. A third type of ethical discipline is psychophysical ethics. To promote inner well-being, we need to practice ethical ways of treating our own bodies and minds. This includes taking good care of the body, following a healthy diet, and getting the right kind and amount of physical exercise. It also involves engaging in mental behaviour that is conducive to balancing the mind and reducing disturbing mental states such as hatred, greed, confusion, fear, and jealousy. And then the last point is eliminate compulsive thinking. Now, I think all of us have some obsessive compulsive thinking about certain things. And very often, a lot of this obsessive compulsive thinking, is it gone out, is it? Yeah. A lot of our obsessive compulsive thinking, I think, comes from this worldview, the source of happiness and suffering's out there. And then we have all sorts of thinking about how I can get those things there that seem to make me happy, or how I can avoid those things out there that seem to be the source of my suffering. So again, I think if we shift our worldview from the source of happiness and sufferings out there to in here, then I think we can start to really reduce a lot of this obsessive compulsive thinking. So on that note, in Attention Revolution, he says, many of us let compulsive thoughts dominate our minds. These won't stop overnight, but as we engage in shamatha practice both during and between sessions, it is important to observe the mind's activities and restrain it when it falls into thought patterns that aggravate mental disturbances. So that's one of the things I mentioned, I think, once or twice earlier, is in daily life, is really switch off this blah, blah, blah mind as much as possible. Of course, sometimes in daily life we need to think, but a lot of the time we're doing some sort of physical activity, and we don't need to have blah, blah, blah mind running when we're doing physical activity. So it's going to be very helpful that whenever you're doing any physical activity, to be fully present in that physical activity and switch off that conceptual mind, and then you'll actually enjoy that physical activity much more.